Perfect. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Patrick McCarthy. I'm the head of local authority services here in the Housing Agency. So just on behalf of the Housing Agency, I'd like to welcome you all to our second of this webinar series. This one is entitled Implementing Trauma-Informed Care in Professional Practice. Today we have Dr. Maria Lotty from University College Cork. Maria is also joined by Allanah Canton. Allanah is a former student of Maria's, and she's a social care worker with several years' experience in the provision of homelessness services. She's now studying a master's in social work in Trinity College Dublin. Maria is a lecturer in the School of Applied Social Studies in UCC and a research associate with the Institute for Social Sciences in the 21st Century. Maria has over 20 years professional experience working with children and families in assessment, therapeutic and project management roles. She has developed a CPD certificate in trauma-informed care, theory and practice in UCC. This is the first university accredited programme in trauma-informed care in Ireland that aims to support practitioners who work directly with children, young people, adults and families. Just before we begin, just to note to you that the session is being recorded and will be published on the Housing Agency's YouTube channel. And also, if you have any questions about the presentation, please submit them on the chat and we will try to address as many of these as possible, but just please remember that there are a lot of people on this call. So if we can't answer your question today, we'll try and address it after the session. So I'll hand over to Maria now. Thanks, Maria.
Thank you, Pat. Welcome, everybody. And thank you for inviting me to talk about the TARA model. So TARA stands for Trauma, Action and Resilience into Action. It was developed by a growing community of practice informed by my PhD research to understand how to embed trauma-informed practices into our work to improve standards of care and outcomes for those we work with. And trauma-informed practices are those daily practices, initiatives, interventions that we carry out in the course of our work that reflect the principles and assumptions of trauma-informed care. So if we consider the guiding principles or values that underpin trauma-informed practices, these are essentially person-centered values that underpin best practice. Best practice strives to provide safety, give choice, enable trust, to collaborate, to empower, and is culturally sensitive. And furthermore, when we consider the four assumptions for trauma-informed care, described as the 4 R's, realizing, recognizing, responding, and resisting re-traumatization, I would argue that many professionals who work in social services, including housing, already have years of practice wisdom that reflect these 4 R's. Many of you have borne witness to trauma, domestic abuse, childhood neglect and abuse, homelessness, racial trauma, fleeing from war. You understand what that looks like. You've seen the implications. And in this context, you know how to build relationships and you have supported the journey of recovery for many people, I have no doubt. And I hope you've also shared moments of satisfaction in your work. But you may not be explicitly articulating these practices as trauma-informed practices. So the TARA model really came about with trying to understand how we can integrate existing practice wisdom with new knowledge from contemporary trauma theory. How do we bridge this old or this new knowledge and old knowledge, this integrated knowledge base into concrete practice changes that support our service users? I believe TARA gives us an opportunity to re-examine and challenge service cultures, policies and procedures that undermine our best practices. And I believe it helps us to support reclaiming and re-emphasizing relational strengths-based practices, anti-racist practices with the benefit of a deeper understanding of trauma experience. So it is a holistic model. And it draws from learnings from our practice wisdom, but also from the 3 key areas of research on new contemporary trauma theory, attachment theory, which is the basis of relational practice, and theories of resilience that underpin our strengths-based practice. And I think it's helpful to consider how we integrate trauma-informed practices into our current practice along a continuum, because it will be different with regard to each of our specific roles. So we can think about this, I think, as a level 1, which is a basic awareness, an awareness of what trauma is, how it impacts those who use the service, who work in the service. It's like, I think, a universal responsibility for all staff within an organisation, regardless of the role, like you could say children's first training. And then along the continuum, I think a deeper, more in-depth knowledge of the lived and living experience of trauma is required for those in practice, supervision or management roles. And then further along, I think we can think of bridging a knowledge base to a skill set to embed these trauma-informed practices into professional roles. So the model itself has 6 core components. They are interlinked and they overlap. And each component relates to those who we work with, the inner circle, but also to us as well, the outer circle. And the components are 1, understanding lived experience, 2, building embodied safety, 3, building relational safety, 4, building safe coping, 5, building mentalizing, and 6, building collaboration. Tara recognises that trauma experience and recovery must be considered in the context of a person's interconnected experience across their social ecology, and thus beyond an individual experience, as well as those found in their interpersonal sphere, their community, and the social structures of our society. Tara model also recognises that frontline practitioners have a unique position to become the anchor for therapeutic change, because they provide foundational support through experiences of relational safety and stability. So the model has one overarching principle, and this is that this integration equips us to be more effective in working with those who experience trauma. And this involves a shared experience of partnership and empowerment for us as well as those we work with. The first component involves understanding lived and living experience. And this means developing a trauma-informed mindset through knowledge of trauma, trauma exposure, how it's experienced, its implications for us as well as those we work with. This understanding is positioned by the belief that trauma is unique to the individual, deeply personal, subjective, and thus the person who has experienced it is an expert by virtue of their experience. As Tara focuses both on practitioner experiences as well as those we work with, the mindset involves practicing through and in a parallel process. This means when we are working with trauma or when we are working in the face of trauma, we are acutely aware of how this intersects with our own personal trauma history and perhaps ongoing exposure to acute and/or vicarious or secondary traumas in the work. So this isn't easy, bringing an awareness of how our own experiences come into the work. When we recognize these shared experiences between those we work with and ourselves, and are indeed between ourselves as practitioners and our managers, only then we can respond more effectively in a more trauma-informed way, a thoughtful, less reactive, defensive way. As Gabor Mate tells us, the most important aspect of what we do is not what we do, it is who we actually are, what we bring to the present situation in the present moment, right there and then. So thus fundamentally to Tara is engaging and supporting a parallel process for building resilience for those who encounter the services that we work in as well as for us. So Tara fosters a strengths-based mindset orientated towards supporting engagement in the process of resilience, our capacity to adapt positively in the face of adversity. Trauma doesn't operate in a vacuum. Human experience is much more complex than that. The lived experience of trauma involves a complex interplay between many variables, and the impact of adversity and trauma can be shielded in the presence and availability of resources. And these resources are not just found only within the individual, within us or within our service users. Perhaps we could describe these as resiliency skills or coping skills, but these resources are also found across our social ecology, in safe relationships, in community resources that foster a sense of belonging, and in the social structures of our society. Secure and stable housing, a home, can only be considered a core resource in this regard. These resources give us strength to face adversity, provide us with positive experiences that can be built over time, and help us engage in resilience. So thus, resilience is a collective responsibility. However, when the weight of adversity or trauma is too great, often in the absence of resources to help us shield the impact, adverse experiences may be prolonged, repetitive, interpersonal by nature, may involve chronic forms of trauma or systemic forms of trauma. Adapting positively can be very difficult, but nevertheless, we must adapt to keep going. And these ways of coping can become problematic over time and have serious implications for our health, our relationships, and how we navigate the world. Dr. Van der Kolk tells us every trauma survivor I've met is resilient in his or her own way, and every one of their stories inspires awe at how people cope. So how do we recognize these ways of coping that have become defaults when stressed, or ways of living that are often rooted in trauma for those we work with and indeed for ourselves? So the thermometer regulation gives and provides us with a shared reference to recognize ours and others' autonomic nervous stress system responses. The red zone, the top of the thermometer, relates to that fight-flight reaction, hyperarousal zone. This is when the body becomes hyperaroused. We experience this as increased heart rate, quickened breath, raised body temperature, our stomachs doing some somersaults, muscles are tight, the body is restless, emotions may be things like anxiety, frustration, and stress, feeling overwhelmed. Our thinking can be very chaotic. What you see is behavior that is hyper, impulsive, inflexible, aggressive, anxious, manipulative, yelling, shouting, crying, out of control perhaps. For some, this has become a default. This is a familiar place, and this is where they go often when stressed. How do these behaviors provoke us to react? For others, it's a freeze reaction at the bottom of the thermometer, the blue zone, the hypoarousal zone. The body communicates this to us. The heart rate slows down, the breath slows, muscles feel loose, the body feels cold, emotions are disconnected, shut down, numb, thoughts can be disconnected. Perhaps there's even memory loss. What you see is behaviors that avoid, zone out, disengage, withdraw, distance, isolate. And for some, this is their default, their familiar place, the place they occupied, a place that served them well when they were experiencing overwhelming stress, kept them safe. But now when they are re-experiencing stress, they go there again by default. And how do these behaviors provoke us to react? And then we can think of the green zone, the optimal arousal zone. Here the body feels calm, safe, and connected. We have the capacity to engage with others, connect to our emotions, regulate our emotions and behaviors. We feel connected. What you see is behavior that is purposeful, flexible, considered, responsive, regulated. Trauma involves prolonged activation of the stress response system. This makes us highly sensitized to fight, flight, and freeze reactions by repeated doses of the stress hormone cortisol. It heightens our bias to threat, seeing threat when there is no threat. Our reactions are more easily activated or triggered by experiences, reminders that propel us into the red zone or the blue zone, creating vicious cycles of getting stuck in hyper or hypoarousal, and reducing our capacity to come into the green zone and engage in the process of resilience. Trauma-informed practices support not entrenching these defaults, but support a pathway out of them through a practice mindset and skill set. This skill set is illuminated in the other components of the TARA model, starting with component 2, building embodied safety. This is the first core skill. We know trauma involves an embodied experience of terror that is remembered in the body outside of our conscious awareness, embedded in our sensory experience, leaving an embodied memory. These can be easily triggered and re-experience and activate our stress response, where we can get stuck into red or blue zone territory. Our practice aim is to maximize embodied safety with those we work with, to support experiences of embodied safety, a body that feels calm, feels safe, and regulated, being in the green zone. We bring attention to building safety in the spaces we work in, the language we use, the responses we make in each and every interaction through our bodies, our gestures, our tone of voice, our eye contact. We are cognizant that we can only offer this invitation to calm another's body's embodied experience when we ourselves are regulated, when our bodies are in the green zone. The next component is building relational safety, the second core skill. Trauma involves a deep breach of trust on many levels. When we think about this, we can think of child abuse and neglect, domestic abuse. Our attachment system also adapts to cope. So building on the development of embodied safety, feeling safe in a relationship is a core practice aim of TARA. TARA brings our attention to exploring this attachment adaptation for those we work with, how to recognize it, when is it activated, when it's in red zone territory of anxious attachment behaviors like clinginess, attention needing, but yet comfort is difficult to accept. Our blue zone territory of avoidant attachment behaviors like withdrawing, avoiding, wanting to be invisible, isolate. What triggers it? How it's experienced by another. How does it provoke us and trigger us? How can we create, offer, share, and support green zone relational experience, build trust and safety in relationships? These relational skills are not new to us. They are core to our best practice, reflecting relational practices that are curious, attuned, sensitive, and responsive, and we follow through on what we say. Next, we come to component 4, building safe coping, the third core skill. As we develop our understanding of the experience of trauma and seek to build embodied and relational safety, our practice aim is to build safe coping strategies. We understand the adaptive strategies that in the past served a purpose in coping with overwhelming emotions and driving unwanted fear-based behaviors. We can now reframe how we see these emotions and behavior using a TARA mindset. Using a TARA mindset, we draw our attention to below the waterline of the iceberg, not what's on top in full view, what's in our face, but underneath. Bringing our understanding to seeing these emotions and behaviors as ingenious ways of coping, that for some kept them safe at a time when their body and heart was in a state of terror. We understand that even though the danger has passed, they're still stuck. They are so very easily activated and repeatedly propelled into vicious cycles of red or blue zone behaviors. We now can pause, make an informed response, cease to react, and unwittingly fuel and reinforce these emotional, behavioral, unhealthy ways of coping. Now we see not just the behaviors, our focus has shifted. We see, or we are open to discover the drivers of the behavior, the unmet needs, the hidden needs. We can work out what is the part we play in addressing these. When these When these are addressed, the behaviour dissipates, new, safer coping strategies can be built, ways to support emotional and behavioural regulation. Next, we come to component 5, building mentalising, our 4th core skill. The first thing to say about mentalising is we can't be trauma-informed practitioners without mentalising, or to put it in a more accessible way, our capacity to be reflective practitioners. Reflective practice is at the core of best practice. It involves awareness of our own embodied state, our own emotional state, indeed our own relational experience. Through reflective practice, we can remain in green zone territory in the face of trauma. But there's another side to mentalising, our capacity to imagine what's going on in the mind of those we work with. How do we imagine their embodied emotional relational experience? How is this driving their thoughts, their feelings, their desires, their wishes? And this is not an easy place to occupy, as you are exposed on a daily basis to vicarious trauma, when you bear witness to pain, hurt, and abuse. But vicarious trauma does not have to become traumatizing and block our capacity to mentalize and propel us into green or red zone territory, leaving us stuck in vicious cycles of reactive practice, mirroring the trauma we face and placing us at risk of burnout. We need to be in the green zone to mentalize. Only here we are open, curious, bring empathy. As we model this in our practice, we support the development of mentalizing in others. Building mentalizing is a core practice aim of Tara. And when we bring others into the green zone, the parallel process is ignited. It is the space of reciprocity, the space for resiliency building experiences, the space for supporting a journey of post-traumatic growth, both for us and those we work with. Lastly, we come to component 6, collaboration, our final skill. Collaboration is the core of the work of social services and indeed of housing professionals. Many of us by nature are systemic thinkers, and we do not work alone. Many of your families, those you work with, are connected to other organizations and professionals. Tara advocates for a shared, united effort, driving consistency of approach within your team, your organization, and across organizations. For building collaboration is a core practice aim of Tara. And this brings us back to resilience. Resilience is a collective responsibility. So Tara supports increasing resources across a person's socio-ecology, such as secure housing, as well as developing safe coping strategy to support engaging in the process of resilience and moving beyond unwanted trauma-based default strategies. So looking at the current research, Dublin South Central area of Tusla has become a champion for integrating trauma-informed practices in child welfare and protection through a research-based collaborative with UCC. And together we have embarked on a 3-year plan to improve practice in responding to the complex needs and improve outcomes for the children and families who come into contact with the service. So we have recently reported with our phase 1 findings, and just to give you a selection of the findings briefly, there were reported positive findings in professional development gains and improved practices in child and family welfare services following the implementation of the Tara model. So the professional practice gains were around an increase in trauma-informed knowledge, as well as the integration of new trauma-informed knowledge and practice within existing practice knowledge. Also, the study found participants had this real amplified self-reflection. It's reflected in working through the parallel processes, as I described earlier. And the participants also reported an increase in their professional practice confidence, as well as in their professional confidence in strengthening some of the existing programs they deliver within their service. And the improvements in practices were reported across frontline practice, supervision, and in leadership roles in 3 areas. So firstly, child and family practices. So participants said they had changed their language that they were using in their case file notes, court reports. They had changed how they approach their decision-making in case planning, direct work with clients, and in their referrals processes. Secondly, they reported improvements in practices for practitioner resilience. So they reported integrating trauma-informed practices in supervision, as well as team meetings, complex case review meetings, and case conferences. And finally, the third area that they reported making practice changes was in their collaborative practices. And they reported new collaborative working practices between their colleagues across their area with their foster carers as well as their external partners. So as I come to the end, I think Tara offers us an opportunity to re-emphasize and re-establish best practices, and also to integrate recent developments in theory and research that are relevant for our practice. I suppose I also think we must recognize that the research to support trauma-informed care is at an emergent stage. So we must be open and we must wait to see what this field, how it is going to emerge going forward. To end this presentation, I wish to end with the words of a social care leader with many years' experience describing this approach as a game changer for frontline practitioners, as it informs us how to respond therapeutically to the impact of childhood adversity from a strengths-based perspective, guided by a coherent framework. So thank you very much for listening.
That was brilliant. Thanks, Maria. I don't know if people have questions they want to put into the chat. But I suppose more of a comment maybe than anything else. You mentioned at the outset, Maria, about that we're kind of doing a lot of this without maybe formally recognizing it, and I suppose just from a personal perspective, as you were running through it, it struck me that like an awful lot of this is about empathy and dealing with people in the right way. And I suppose what struck me was that varying different successes in working with people who have experienced trauma, and on one day you could really get through to somebody and make fantastic progress, and the next day you could be sitting with somebody similarly and not make the same progress. So for me, it's very useful to have that framework to kind of understand what we're doing, as opposed to kind of almost get lucky on a day and get unlucky on another day. It's a really useful framework to understand how you're working and why it's impactful and why it's successful, and why in the less successful cases, why that's occurring as well. So I think we have a couple of questions coming in, mainly compliments. One anyway, Maria, be with how can they avail of the Tara training? So I don't know if that's possible, but maybe if you want to come back on that one.
Yeah, it's available in UCC, the CPD Trauma Informed Care Program. It's an online program. So I'll be sharing my slides with the housing agency, and the details are on the end of the presentation. So you'll be available to do that next October if you were interested.
Good stuff. And without putting you under any pressure, Allanah, do you have any kind of, maybe you want to come in on any of that stuff, or?
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to say thank you so much for Maria for inviting me to be part of the panel today, and the housing agency. And as someone who actually completed the CBT, the course that Maria was referencing there, it's very interesting, the whole Tara model, and I have found it very useful in my practice. So I guess just echoing what Maria was saying, that trauma-informed care sounds all new, but it's not new territory. Essentially, we have been navigating this in a person-centered approach and relationship-based practice for a long time. And it's funny when I see the Tara model, it reminds me a little bit of Brenner's socio-ecological framework in its structure. And we have to appreciate and understand when we're working with people who have gone through trauma, that, you know, the nature of the various systems that they live and operate within and how that can have an impact. So just want to thank so much for Maria for conceptualizing the model, and it's very useful for me in, you know, my practice as a social carer and now a social, well, training to be a social worker. So I just want to thank Maria for that. So yeah, from my perspective, I worked for a few years in the realm of homeless services, responding primarily most of the time to families who found themselves homeless and are residing in emergency accommodation. And they would have had times encountered traumatic circumstances. And I felt that I would benefit from further training in something to give me confidence as a professional. So yeah, getting involved with UCC on the trauma course was amazing and kind of transformational in an aspect, and adapting my practice and becoming trauma aware. And even just how I relate to my clients now, but also how I view the work and the workplace in general, and my team. So yeah, like the few of the tools that Maria referenced there in terms of the iceberg model and the, you know, in terms of the driver's behavior, and then that there's something going down deep underneath, and then also the thermometer regulation, there were two kind of key tools that I found very, very useful in my work with working with people who have encountered trauma. And I'm just thinking of one woman that I worked for a long time in particular who had very, very complex trauma across her lifespan in terms of early childhood kind of trauma, but also, you know, as an adult, and how when I was completing the course in UCC, and I was making reference to the Tara model while I was working with her, and I think as Pat explained there, you know, sometimes it can come quite easy to try and relate to someone, but sometimes it's a lot of work to build up that relationship. So the Tara model was a really good way for me to understand where she was coming from and to try and reach that olive branch, to not just jump in and say, hey, we need to get your GP appointment right now, or we need to find, you know, your child a school place. This, you know, it was me slowly coming to her each week, and, you know, her having the openness and availability, and me doing things like using the thermometer regulation or things like that to say, okay, you know, you're in the red zone right now. What can we do? Can we do a breathing technique to get you down to the green? And then, you know, over time, she kind of got used to me kind of modeling that or guiding that. And then when she was in a green space, she was able to kind of have a bit more clarity, a thought of like, okay, well, I want my child to go to this school, or, you know, I envision myself moving to this area, you know, and I would like to link in with that GP. So in terms of me as a professional, it's not jumping to the conclusion of, okay, we need to do this right now. And, you know, essentially, I don't want, you know, we're trying to empower the client to make decisions that make sense in their life, instead of me stepping in and being like, I think as a professional, you need to do this, because we often see that that can break down sometimes and doesn't lead to successful outcomes. So yeah, that's really all from myself in terms of how I found this has changed my practice, and being that anchor person, as Maria referenced, or being that, you know, we're empowering these people who have encountered dire circumstances in their life to take back the control and power, and that they're able to regulate themselves with these practices, and you know, time, also having the time and the compassion and the empathy to continually show up as well, which is difficult, you know, in some circumstances when you know, teams or pressures are under-resourced. But and even one last point in terms of how viewing trauma for me as a professional in terms of the vicarious nature of it is so important. And at the time, the team that I was working on, the management were very open to the facilitation of talking about trauma in our team meeting. And I was able to bring resources in terms of the trauma stress scales and other resources that we got access to on the programme. And I just found that was really helpful for me to protect myself and build my own resilience as a professional, and to stay in the sector and working in and around this area, because we all know sometimes it can be heavy work. So having those kind of self-care practices to stay resilient and to stay hopeful in the work. So I have a big thank to give to Maria, because you know, I'm gone on to a point of furthering my studies to completing the Masters in Social Work in Trinity at the moment. And you know, completing and knowing this trauma-informed language and space has really enabled myself to have hope to continue on and to stay and keep providing the good work and the quality of service to clients who need it. So that's it for me.
Thanks a million, Allanah. And I think, again, you're really important point there about looking after ourselves. I guess you can't do the work without doing that. So just bear with me. I'll just get my questions there. Okay, so Maria, probably not an easy question, but just one that's come in is, do you find the TARA model effective in all trauma cases?
It's a very good question. Well, I definitely couldn't say I have the research to back that up. I think human experience is so incredibly unique and diverse. I don't think it could possibly work for everybody. And I think some people don't identify being traumatized as well. So I think it's really important to you know, take the lead of the person you're working with. Like, and if that's not part of their narrative, that's okay. But for me, it's been my journey I started when I was practicing as a social worker. I worked child protection and fostering, and it certainly gave me more confidence, and it really rooted me in the kind of practitioner I wanted to be, that perhaps I'd lost sight of a bit with you know, as practices become, I suppose, orientated towards business models, and, you know, it really helped to center me and bring me back. And once I was there, then, you know, I'm dealing with what I'm working with in this moment and led by the person I'm working with. So it's hard to answer that question, you know. Of course, it's not going to, no one approach is the answer to anything. That's the other thing. This is that brilliant webinar, the single story, you know, but it certainly has been helpful for me in my practice, and the current research that we're doing with Dublin South Central, the results are very positive.
Great, thanks, Maria. And like, it's just another questions come up, and maybe Allanah might, I don't know, Allanah, you might want to comment as well, but just a question, how do you work where there's resistance to the model?
Yeah, I could take that one, Maria. That's all right. Yeah, so as kind of Maria stated there, that question links to the last question we had. You know, so in terms of, you're just trying to show up for the person, and you know, if they don't want to engage, you're not going to force them to engage. You know, my work, it was always in a voluntary capacity, you know. So I guess using that sense of self that you have, you know, that you are a human too, and you're being empathetic towards their situation, you're putting that olive branch out. But if they don't want to engage and they don't want the help, I guess I was always of the opinion in my work, well, you know where I am, or here's my contact number. And when you feel you're ready to engage in that work. Now, sometimes people are coming and they're like, well, I want access to this resource or this service, and it might be just that, and that's fine. But then sometimes, often I found when working with clients, it would start with, I need access to a GP, or I need my social welfare payment. But then, like the iceberg, as Maria referenced earlier, you know, things then kind of come out on the underneath in terms of you've shown that you can go out on a limb and collaborate and help this person to achieve that task. You're building that little bit of trust, and then something else might come out of the woodwork. Like I would have seen that sometimes someone would need access to maybe counselling in the background, but over a few weeks of linking in with me talking about social welfare payment, you know, they would feel then comfortable to divulge that or other things. But yeah, to answer the question, it's really a phased approach, and when they're ready to link in, and you know, I would never force this on anyone, and it's just as it goes. Yeah.
Can I come back in there, Pa, as well?
You can.
Like, it's not a prescriptive model, you know, it's, you know, I did say these components, they're interlinked, they overlap. I mean, and it's for me, it's a way of helping someone frame, you know, understanding trauma. And, but like you come to it from your own practice position, and it supports your practice. So instead of thinking of it as this is the overarching practice and I need to fit into this, actually, you know, understanding what kind of practitioner you are, and if this can support that, and you can come to, you know, you can use parts of it. People use parts of it, or, but I suppose I put it all together as a way of trying to it's a great, like a lot of my students say to me, it's just such a great reference point to go back to, because it's very clearly articulated, and particularly if you're using it across a team or across an area, you're all speaking the same language, you know. So, but it's not that you have to go, okay, I got to do 1, 2, 3. It's not, it's really this idea of a mindset, which actually came from my PhD research. The foster carers that I worked with, they said it's changed our mindset. So if you start thinking in this way, it'll integrate into your practice. So it's not something that, you know, the idea you throw out everything you know and this is the answer to everything. Absolutely not. The first thing is what kind of practitioners you want to be, and then bring some of this and integrate it through.
Thanks, Maria. And I think you've probably answered that. Just the person who put the original question was just saying they were wondering about resistance from practitioners, but like to an extent, maybe the same answer applies. Like it isn't prescriptive, and I guess, like, I mean, maybe I'm oversimplifying it, but you know, completely disregarding it is almost disregarding empathy, I dare say.
I think I come across resistance, say with colleagues, when it's actually more to do with having to go to, you know, the hard part of the work is the self-reflective piece. So, you know, perhaps that's part of the resistance from other colleagues. But I think when people see the benefits to it and how it supports the work, people kind of come along with it, you know, so it kind of creates the momentum. And, you know, one of the principles of trauma-informed care is choice. Allanah already mentioned that. So it's an invitation to, you know, you're offering someone choice if you want, and the timing mightn't be right, but you offer that invitation to maybe start thinking and exploring in this way. But you keep, you know, ensuring that door is open as well, you know what I mean? And, you know, people may come to it at different points. So resistance, I think, is very powerful, because when you've got resistance, you've got something to work with. I always think about that. And if you think of resistance as a form of behavior, what are the drivers underneath the resistance, you know?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So I think that's, to a large extent, that's it in terms of questions. There are a number of compliments coming in for you, Maria and Allanah. And you know, some suggestions maybe that trauma-informed care could apply, you know, outside of say traditional service provision to vulnerable groups, and you know, adopting it in colleges or schools, or you know, across the board, maybe even in just work environments that are not necessarily connected to service provision. So I think that's a very valid point. And the same person has said Cork seems to be miles ahead of anywhere else with this approach, which is obvious. That's the case with most things, you know. So, but no, listen, I think that's it, unless there's anybody else wants to put in a last minute question. Just see if there's anything else comes in. Just one other comment, just trauma-informed practice is important working with people experiencing mental health issues to support the individual and you and yourself as a practitioner. I think that's come true today, definitely, that there are two things at stake here. It's, you know, it's service provision, but it's also minding yourself, making sure you're able to provide that service over many years as opposed to a couple of years and then experiencing burnout and that type of thing.
Absolutely, I would identify with that. And even I'm currently on placement on a mental health team. And like it's, you know, I know we're primarily talking about people who are encountering homeless here, but I would echo all of those sentiments that it's so applicable. We're all humans. We all encounter various aspects of trauma in our life. So it's very, very interchangeable skills we're talking about here. Yeah.
Good point, Allanah. Okay. Well, I think we'll end it there. So just finally, just thanks again to Maria and Allanah. It was really interesting, really informative. Such a short space of time. I think we'll all come away with something from this. I'll just thank Graham and the policy and practice section for everything they do on highlighting important approaches to the way we do our work as practitioners. And lastly, we just would hope that we'll see you all at the third session. That's on the 20th of February, and we will be joined by Niamh Randall from Respond and Una Burns from Novus Initiatives, and we'll be looking at trauma-informed care in homeless service settings. So thanks everyone, and thanks for your questions, and thanks for engaging, and we'll see you the next time.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye now. Bye, everybody.